Good afternoon. I'm Diane Sare, president of the LaRouche Organization, and this interview is being recorded on Monday, December 16th, the birthday of Ludwig van Beethoven, appropriately enough, who once said that if people understood his music, there would be no more war. I think something very important for people to consider when they try to separate scientific thinking from creative genius, which produces works of great beauty and demonstrates a certain love of mankind. And when we see the hideous policies and actions under the name of geopolitics. So I have two phenomenal guests. I'm going to bring them both up on the screen for a moment. Vanessa Beeley, a highly regarded independent journalist who has been in Syria for a number of years, reporting there courageously, and Senator and Colonel Richard Black, formerly in the Virginia legislature and Judge Advocate General in the US Army, and also has had some experience in Syria. So I think to get us started, Vanessa, since you have been there, been on the ground, were there for the recent actions that seem to shock the world, I would like to give the floor to you to tell us what happened and your perspective on the situation there.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me on to explain what has been happening. Because, yeah, there has been a tsunami of misinformation regarding the entire situation. Very much a blame game, blaming different factions for betrayal and for surrender and so on. So I think it's important to clarify. First of all, I think it's important to put context that Syria, since 2011, has been the target of US, UK, Gulf state, Israeli, Turkish-led regime change war, which included the invasion of the country by various terrorist factions, some of which were incubated in Iraq by the United States, like Nusra Front and ISIS, others that are made up of foreign extremist mercenaries also operating alongside the indigenous groups that have been fostered, armed, funded, and equipped by the West and their allies. And so for the last 14 years, Syria has been fighting this war. Since 2020, it had, let's say, reached a stage of stagnation where 3/4 of Syria's borders were effectively occupied by hostile states and their proxy forces. So from the northwest to the northeast, down to the southeast, the south, and the only really friendly border was with Lebanon, that of course itself has recently been under attack by Israel and the United States. And so therefore, for some time we had known, especially since the Israeli genocide began in Palestine, in Gaza on October the 7th, and has continued since then. We knew that there was at some point going to be an attack, particularly from the northwest, which is Idlib of Syria, which is, as Brett McGurk described it, the largest Al-Qaeda haven since 9/11. Those forces have been fostered, as I said, by the United States and their allies, including Gulf states, more recently by Turkey, and then by Ukraine. Ukraine special forces have been in the northwest of Syria training, arming, and equipping these groups and giving them specifically drone technology that they didn't have before, in return for Abu Mohammad al Jolani, the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was formerly Nusra Front, and Jolani was formerly ISIS, of course, when he first entered Syria. Jolani has been sending militants from his groups to Ukraine to fight against Russia in return for the technology and weapons given to them by Ukraine. So for about 3 months, we had been aware that there was potential of an attack from the northwest. At the same time as Israel and Lebanon agreed on a ceasefire, at that time, we all knew that that was time for Netanyahu to pivot towards Syria to destroy, during the ceasefire, to destroy the weapons supply lines from Iran, Iraq, through Syria and into Lebanon, but also to destroy Syria's capability of producing and manufacturing weapons that were also being supplied to the resistance factions in Lebanon and Palestine. And at this point, I think it was hours after the ink dried on the ceasefire agreement, the attack began from the northwest, from Idlib, by the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham coalition. The first city to be attacked was Aleppo. There were sleeper cells already in Aleppo that were triggered to start, let's say, spreading panic among Syrian people by appearing on video in the center of the city and desecrating statues and so on. But we knew at that point that the main body of the terrorist forces hadn't yet entered Aleppo. There were 30,000 Syrian army forces stationed in and around Aleppo. They withdrew, apart from in the east, where one particular Syrian army brigade remained in situation. From the reports that I've heard, at that point, Sergei Kessel, who was then the commander of the Russian forces in Syria, he withdrew his forces to Haimamim, leaving the one Syrian army brigade to fight alone in the east of Aleppo. They then came down to the south and they released some of the people from the Shia Muslim towns of Nubal and Zara, and your other guest knows them very well, I think, who had managed to evacuate but had been trapped in the southern area of Aleppo alongside other civilians and military cadets. So they were freed. And then the snowball effect was extraordinary. There was a lot of miscommunication. There were a lot of reports that Syrian Army Command were not able to communicate with their forces. So there was a lot of confusion on the battlefield. The next city to fall was Hama, although the terrorists were held back in northern Hama, which is the area of many of the Orthodox Christian Syrian towns that basically held back the terrorist forces for some time. And then basically it accelerated from Hama onwards. So when they arrived in Homs, there were Hezbollah forces and Iranian forces and Syrian army forces that stood their ground, but in the end had to capitulate because other members of the Syrian army surrendered. We were then told that there was potential for a deal where President Assad would remain in power for at least 6 months to hand over to a transitional government. We were told that there would be some kind of ceasefire brokered by the backers of the terrorist groups. So at this point, it's Turkey, Israel, and the United States and Qatar that were involved in engineering these attacks. And then literally that night, the terrorists arrived in the outskirts of Damascus. Israel started bombing with bunker buster bombs the Syrian army air defense units, which were very close to where I live. And by the morning, it became clear that Damascus had also basically fallen. So for me, at that point, the border was closed, but with an excellent driver, a very brave driver, I managed to get through the border and into Lebanon.
Wow, that's quite a report. So if you want to pause, and Senator Black may have some things to say in response, and I have a whole bunch of questions, but I want to hear what he has to say, and then we'll go from there. So Senator Black.
Well, that was an excellent report, and I really appreciate the work that Vanessa has done. She's been quite heroic in exposing the truth about what's going on in Syria, and I appreciate that. Just if I could just correct one thing on my introduction, I was a member of the Judge Advocate General's Corps. I was not the Judge Advocate General. So I was a colonel in the JAG Corps. If I can just back up a little bit, President Assad took power in 2000. He didn't want to be the president of Syria, but his brother died in an accident, and he was essentially ordered by his father to return. And he had spent a great deal of his time in England, and he was a doctor. He was a trained doctor, and he was dating a woman, Asma Assad, who had been employed by Goldman Sachs. Both of them extraordinarily westernized and extraordinarily intelligent people. And they went about reforming Syria, and they made dramatic improvements in the economy. Now, this is before the U.S. began the war there. But by the year 2010, 10 years into his rule, Syria had strong growth, high levels of foreign direct investment, and their GDP, gross domestic product, increased in a single year by 11%. So it was booming. This was the highest value that it had achieved since President Assad took over. But the U.S. had decided that we were going to overthrow the legitimate, constitutionally elected government of Syria. And in 2007, the U.S. Embassy put out a very important cable that was later released by WikiLeaks that laid out the steps that we were going to take to destabilize the government. We weren't at war with them. They weren't hostile towards us, but we had decided to take them down. And one of the things we were going to do was to, we're going to spread rumors about instability. And we were also going to develop conflicts, religious conflicts. At the time, Syria had a tremendous reputation for religious harmony between Christians, between Muslims and various groups. And we had decided we're going to pick at the scab of religious differences and use that to create violence. So in any event, and later we have this Arab Spring that breaks out. There's one individual who commits suicide in Tunisia. The CIA, MI6 used that to spread this notion of Arab Spring and create demonstrations throughout the Middle East. Anyway, that's sort of the framework for where we ended up here. Now, President Assad, he was enormously popular with the Syrian people. He fought the war, and the Syrian army was enormously valiant, and they fought against proxy terrorists, the ISIS, the Al Qaeda, and all of the surrounding groups, and they fought against 2/3 of the world's economic and military strength, including the U.S., all of NATO, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, just tremendous forces arrayed against this one small country of about 22 million people. And they did that very well. And eventually, with the assistance from Hezbollah over in Lebanon, and the assistance of Iran that entered into the war a couple years later, and then eventually, with great reluctance, Russia provided air power that sort of tipped the balance, and the Syrian army was able to sweep across and recapture. They would have recaptured the entire country, except that the United States landed troops. We invaded northern Syria, occupied it, and set up a rump state around the Kurds, which had gotten a lot of positive publicity in Western press. Now, the Kurds in the north are a minority. The Arab Muslims and the Arab Christians constitute the majority of northern Syria. But the U.S. decided, well, we're going to set up a state for the Kurds. They deserve a Kurdish state. They didn't say, well, they ought to have a, the population majority Muslim, it ought to be a Muslim state. No, we said it's going to be Kurdish. And the reason for this, the reason that we set up the state under the Kurds is because that was the area where all of the Syrian wheat was grown. And this was the wheat that fed the entire nation. And also, most of the Syrian oil came from this area. The oil was very important because it provided 70% of Syria's export revenue. And so all of the imports were paid for with the oil. It was extremely important to to Secretary of State John Kerry when he announced Plan B. He was frustrated because the Syrians had just had a blowout election for President Assad, and some people said, well, the way that their constitution selected candidates was not the American way, and that's true. But the fact is that the streets of cities were flooded. It was people poured out to enjoy a celebration that Assad was reelected. John Kerry came to the Middle East, made an announcement, was very dismissive of the election, and he said we're probably going to need to adopt Plan B. What Plan B was the plan to create starvation within Syria and basically to starve out the country. We had them under a blockade. We had devalued their currency. And so now we absolutely tighten the screws. And eventually, after 13 years of war and certainly with the CIA, with Mossad, and with Turkish intelligence paying off various officials of the Syrian government, there was no money to pay soldiers or anything, and the country at that point just collapsed. So it is interesting where we've gone now. Americans should understand who is now running Syria. This is a fellow named al Jolani. Al Jolani has a long and thoroughly documented history with ISIS and as the head of al-Qaeda in Syria. And he was the head of al-Qaeda in Syria when he launched this latest attack that began on December the 1st. And this is a fellow who has led the head choppers, the rapists, with a campaign of rape that was nationwide. In some cases, crucifixions, in some cases, slave markets where they were marketing captured women and captured little girls who, by the way, brought the highest prices. If you bought a little girl, you had to pay more than you had to pay for grown women because of the pedophile market that was run by these people. So this was as evil a force as you could ever find. Al Jolani was the head of it. Al Jolani has now become the head of the government, and we're trying to paint him a little nicer portrait.
Thanks. I was hoping you would get to that because I saw, the footage that you see here in the US is CNN journalists and New York Times journalists running around with these terrorists. In fact, the one thing I saw was the terrorists liberating the prison, and the CNN anchor woman was hugging the people who were getting released and offering them comfort. So either of you or both of you may want to answer what on earth is up with the US media, I would suspect this is not an accurate picture of the warm, fuzzy, cuddly HTS group.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to step in quickly about Clarissa Ward. That's who you're talking about, is CNN. And I think pretty rapidly, at least 3 of her reports were completely debunked on social media in particular, but one where she was describing allegedly a Lebanese prisoner who, in fact, the people in the background were saying, no, he's not a prisoner. He's actually just come here for hospital treatment. Another one was a boy that they were interviewing who said he'd been in the prison for 14 years and he'd been born there. And when they asked how old he was, he said he was 10 years old. You know, we're almost back to the scenarios in 2011 when Al Jazeera in particular, Qatar poured trillions into the regime change war, as actually admitted by, I think it was the foreign minister, I could have got that wrong, of Qatar. And Al Jazeera, being Qatari state media, was responsible for much of the propaganda in the early days and was swiftly followed up by CNN and BBC and Channel 4 and so on, and Sky News. And Arwa Damon, who was then the CNN journalist, I actually made a documentary with a Syrian filmmaker, Rafik Lutaf, called The Veto, which went into some depth about particularly Al Jazeera and Arwa Damon's literal theatrics. And I mean, it's proven that all of her reports were theatrical events, as of course were the chemical weapon attacks that followed after that, staged by the CIA MI6 funded and established White Helmet organization, embedded with the terrorist groups dominated by Al Qaeda, which is now Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And I guess the question that I have to ask, you know, if there are so many legitimate atrocities committed by the Syrian government, why on earth is this necessity to fake them? If they exist, you know, that you should be able to report on them without having to create this entire narrative complex that they're now basically returning to, all the journalists that are there. We're going back to pre-2012. The Sednaya story, which is the prison that you're talking about, was debunked back in 2016, 2017. Amnesty International then walked back its report because it was proven that the majority of the evidence had been AI generated, that they had not actually visited the prison. The former ambassador to Syria, Peter Ford, went on record saying that the description of Sednaya was ridiculous, that it was a much smaller prison than it is being described. Recently, the Syrian Civil Defense Organization has gone there and said there's nothing here. There are no tunnels, there are no extra rooms, there are no torture chambers, etc. And if you speak to the Christian, the nuns in the monastery of Sednaya, which is very close to Sednaya prison, they will tell you that the majority of the prisoners are the terrorists that tried to attack Sednaya and had, in that particular area, kidnapped nuns and priests from both Sednaya and from Malula. So for them, these were legitimate prisoners. But of course, the media is not going to talk to them. The media is not going to mention the prisons in Idlib that were being run by Jolani. They're not going to talk about the crimes and atrocities committed by Jolani and the extremist groups under his command, which include using child suicide bombers, exploiting child soldiers, etc., and many of the other issues that Senator Black has mentioned just now. None of that will be mentioned because the idea now is to further vilify and criminalize President Assad and his government, to create the kind of Holocaust narrative around his presidency, and to whitewash the terrorist groups that have been responsible for some of the worst atrocities in history against the Syrian people, and in particular against Christians and all minority religious communities and sects inside Syria. And I have interviewed many of the people that were under attack by those groups since 2012, 2013 in all areas of Syria.
Now, Senator Black, you may want to respond to that, but I also wanted to ask your thoughts on NATO. Why is NATO involved in this region? And do you think part of this, the Syrian government falling in the way it did, will be used as a narrative to continue the line that we can destroy Russia, that Russia is weak, or like some have said, Rear Admiral Buchanan, that apparently what Scott Ritter reported from his work on the Hill is that, because he asked, well, is Biden being briefed that Putin is bluffing about a response or the nuclear threshold? And the person said back to Scott, no, Biden is being briefed by the CIA that Putin is not bluffing, but that they think they can win a nuclear war. So I'd like your thoughts. Is this, what's happening here, going to be used to further buttress the provocation and aggression against Russia?
Well, I think it is likely that this will be leveraged against Russia in any way possible. And I don't want to get too far off of the Syria topic for that, but I think it's very likely that there's going to be fallout that will make the war continue, perhaps at some level, maybe not a hot war, maybe a cold war, but a little bit more than it should have in the normal consequence of things. But I do want to follow up just a little what Vanessa said. There are certain playbooks that the CIA and Mossad have used throughout the war, and this is a long period of time. But one of the playbooks is to talk about some mysterious prisons where everybody is being tortured. Now, you would assume, if you heard them, that there were no actual prisoners who commit crimes who are imprisoned in Syria. See, this is part of the thing, is when you start talking, well, these are torture places. Well, they are prisons that are used to confine and house people who commit crimes. There are actually people in Syria who commit murders and rapes and robberies, just like they do in Detroit, Michigan. This is part of the deceit. Now, the other thing, early in the war, very early in, there was a mysterious figure that was called Caesar. And Caesar was this fellow who was paraded around before congressional committees wearing some sort of a hoodie, raincoat, and a face mask. Nobody ever knew who he was, but he presented to the committees, and he said, look, he says, I have pictures of 50,000 people who were killed in the prisons. Well, that's quite an extraordinary thing. I mean, to have the photos of 50,000 people who have been killed. But he made that claim, and people said, oh, yes, it must be John McCain was one. Oh, yes, look at this. And interestingly, after he said, okay, what a terrible regime it is because it's torturing everybody in the prisons, there was just one follow-up report a couple of months later, which said that subsequently 9 of the photographs were verified as people who were likely to have been arrested by the Syrian police forces. And then after that, they dropped it. But right at that point, and I don't know what to make of that report, but it was in mainstream media that they had identified 9 people that they really thought actually were arrested, not necessarily executed, but arrested by the Syrian police, 9 out of 50,000. So it was obviously a hoax. It was obviously put up by the CIA. And to this day, we still don't know who this clown is and why they gave him the name Caesar. Apparently, they didn't know that, that they don't use that term in Syria. I don't know, but but it was crazy. Now, and Vanessa touched on another aspect that was often used by the CIA, and that was these false flag gas attacks. Now, the biggest one, which almost triggered Obama to land U.S. troops and conduct an open invasion of the country, it was in August 21st of 2013. It was the gas attack on a suburb in Damascus using sarin gas. And immediately, as soon as some civilians, there may have been a couple hundred who actually died of sarin gas, when they died, immediately the media was told, you can see, okay, so Assad is killing people with sarin gas. Now, what they didn't tell you is that 2 months earlier, there was an operation by Turkish border, the Border Patrol, which was a pretty legitimate organization at the time, and they, using wiretap information, they broke open a group of 12 terrorists from al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria, and they caught them carrying 2.1 kilograms of sarin nerve gas across the border into Syria. And afterwards, the then Prime Minister Recep Erdogan, who now is the president of Turkey, changed the prosecutor, put a new one in place, released the people, and they all disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to the sarin gas. But that sarin gas and those al-Nusra guys went from there, and they went into Ghouta in the suburbs of Damascus, and the gas was released by al-Nusra, our allies, and those were the ones who released the gas, and then it was blamed on Assad. And this happened many times throughout the war. So we have this the purpose of the CIA and MI6 is to create illusions, and to create illusions that provide pretext for wars and for invasion. It's interesting now. You look at the fallout from all of this, and it was no time at all that Turkey and Qatar are now planning to activate the Qatari gas pipeline from Europe through Syria. This is one of the reasons that the war was triggered, is that Saudi Arabia and Qatar wanted to have a pipeline route through Syria, and President Assad denied it. So already you see all of the vultures preying. You see Israel capturing lands that belong to Syria and moving in on the border. They will never give those lands up. And you see Turkey in the north, and they are moving and taking lands. And now you see Turkey and Qatar going to run the pipeline, and the new government is strictly defensive. I mean, or not defensive. They're just impotent. They can't do anything. They can't defend the country. They have not even recognized the fact that Israel is at war with Syria, haven't acknowledged it. And yet there's a massive bombing campaign going on to destroy the Israelis have sunk the Syrian Navy. They've destroyed all of the anti-aircraft and all of the fighter, the bomber jets that Syria had, to where the country is left defenseless, and it's there simply to be the prey of nations.
Vanessa, what's your sense of that?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think also in 2016, John Kerry was talking about Plan B being the partitioning of Syria. And of course, that's exactly what we're seeing now, as Senator Black referred to. You have Turkey and Erdogan's neo-Ottoman Empire ambitions to effectively annex the entire northern strip of Syria from northwest to northeast. Aleppo was invaded in 2012 by Erdogan's proxy forces, the Al-Tawid brigades, which dismantled all of the industry in Aleppo and relocated it in Turkey. And Erdogan had never given up on this idea also of coming to the Umayyad mosque in Damascus, where of course the remains of John the Baptist are buried, showing again the pluralist nature of Syria that is now being carved up into sectarian statelets. And then you have, as Senator Black quite rightly mentioned, the decimation of Syria's defense industry, but not only its defense industry, all of its science and technology and research laboratories, its weapons production capabilities, more than 500 strikes since December the 1st, and of course escalating very recently to effectively render Syria no longer a sovereign state, because as soon as, of course, it's invaded by multiple hostile states with interests and agendas in the country, and then the entire defense industry is destroyed, then it becomes a playing field for the predator nations that are either by proxy or directly going to be occupying Syrian territory. What, of course, it also does is to open up Syrian airspace to Israeli warplanes to enable them to attack Iraq, eventually Iran, and of course Yemen. They're already issuing threats against Yemen just today. And so what this is really about is the compartmentalization, the balkanization of the resistance axis. So starting with Palestine, that is now completely isolated. Since Trump was elected, the officials in the Zionist regime are talking about full annexation of the West Bank. Lebanon is also, so Palestine is isolated from Lebanon. Lebanon is now isolated from Syria. And the next move by Israel, in my opinion, will be to create a buffer zone up the eastern border of Syria, which will border Jordan and Iraq. And then for the ISIS terrorists that, again, are another proxy of the United States and Israel to be triggered. In fact, they already have been carrying out attacks in Iraq against the Islamic resistance of Iraq there, which are comprised multiple factions that have been resisting on behalf of Palestine until now. And of course, what that will do is then we should mention the Kurds, which have been under the control of the United States, but also serving the purposes of Israel in the northeast of Syria, as we mentioned, stealing and trading Syrian oil and agricultural resources, particularly the wheat. The Kurdish factions then, I believe, will be weaponized by Israel and the United States to join with the Kurdish forces already, of course, established in Iraq and in Iran. So that creates an entire belt of hostile forces and factions on the borders with Iran and inside Iran itself. And we know that the ultimate target for the Zionist regime is Iran. We also know that in the Trump administration, there are members like Vance, for example, who has been very clear that in his opinion, they should punch Iran hard. So, what has happened with the devastation of Syria, the entire resistance axis, its central chain or central link in the chain of countries has been broken and now fully decimated. And of course, the HTS factions have said publicly that they're not going to engage with Israel. So as far as they're concerned, they're quite happy that Israel has further invaded Syrian territory up to 20 kilometers from the center of Damascus.
Good. We have not too much more time. Goodness, this is a new look on the screen here. We have not too much more time. I just wanted to pull up a couple of things because you're mentioning all these nations, which I think it will affect. And again, I wanted to show this map of the region so people see. I don't think my cursor shows, but over on the left side in kind of brownish red is Syria. There's a bright yellow of Israel, green of Palestine, West Bank, Gaza. Oh no, sorry, Jordan is the red, Syria is the greenish looking there. And just under Turkey, Iraq, Iran is not far. And just across the Black Sea, you're already at Ukraine, etc. It's a very central area. And I wanted to just show this map, which says it's called Trade Networks in the Middle Ages and 1200, because as everyone here knows, there is an incredible dynamic of the Belt and Road, which ironically Helga LaRouche presented a revival of the Silk Road in China in 1996, and the British had a character named Sir Leon Britton who went there to oppose it and say they shouldn't have high-speed rail, they should have toll roads so they could make money. And it didn't until Xi Jinping initiated this Belt and Road. Now you do have incredible corridors of transportation being built, and the majority of the world's population and the majority of wheat production, and if Saudi Arabia kind of is playing a kind of on the fence role, but petroleum and so on is going to be held in these other nations. And I think if you look at the region that they call the Middle East, Southwest Asia, or the Middle East, it really is a crucial crossroads, especially when you consider that Africa is, provided mankind doesn't completely annihilate ourselves, is going to be the new market. They're going to grow. They have rejected colonialism. They are building pipelines and power plants and water, hydropower installations, and there's all kinds of attacks on this. But it seems to me, when you look at the forces that are coming together to overthrow these governments, you have combinations that would seem bizarre unless you think of some kind of global perspective. I mean, why would the Israelis be collaborating with ISIS and al-Nusra, who are collaborating with people in the Azov Battalion, who after all have swastikas and Hitler tattoos on them? How do you get this unholy alliance of violent, extremely violent people deployed similarly to the same effect? And I think part of the way that they brainwash Americans is not just all of the lies which have been discussed here about the chemical weapons and the torture, and now the terrorists are the warm fuzzies and the legitimately elected government is the terrorist, and all of this reversal, but also they keep it very, there's no overarching principle. Everything is just chaos. And therefore you can't understand it. You can't do anything about it. And I do think, speaking as an American, it really is incumbent on the American citizens, and particularly the former Congressman Kucinich has been very explicit. The Congress seems to have completely abrogated. They have the ability to shut off the funding for these wars. They could do it in an instant. It's Article 1, Section 8. You had the war powers affirming that, and things could be changed dramatically. But I would like, just in wrapping up, both of your thoughts on this situation, whatever you want to say about it and what you think people should know. So Senator Black, maybe we'll go to you first and then to Vanessa.
Well, I appreciate Vanessa being on with us today. It's your show, it's not mine, but it's always an honor to be with her. She's been very heroic through all of this. It is for anyone who is a bit skeptical about some of the things that they are hearing. I'd invite them to go and Google Mohammad al Jolani and put Mohammad al Jolani $10 million. And you will find there is an FBI website, and there's also one sponsored by an organization of the State Department that talk about the fact that there is a $10 million bounty on al Jolani's head, and it lays out why. He's been the head of Al Qaeda. He was associated with ISIS, and so it's a very dark and sinister thing. I wish that for those Christians who are focused on these things, they would remember the teachings of Jesus, which says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." There are precious few peacemakers, even among our churches. It's war, and I'm not sure that that would be what he would call us to do.
Thank you, Vanessa. Vanessa, please go ahead. Are you there? Yeah.
Sorry, the sound is not brilliant. I don't know if it's my internet or yours. Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned like how on earth is Israel embroiled with the extremist factions in Syria, but then I think you have to look at Netanyahu's connections in particular to revisionist Zionism, which goes back to Jabotinsky, who did a deal with Simon Petlura, the first president of the Republic of Ukraine, to join forces. So basically the Nazis and the Jewish militia to join forces against the threat of then the Soviet Union. So the connections for the Zionists themselves in Ukraine are very strong. And for me, the connection then of Ukraine coming into northwest Syria, which is largely one of the nemesis of Israel in the region, in particular, it's the one strong independent state, because Iraq is effectively pretty much occupied by the United States. Lebanon is, unfortunately, again, the US has played a part in maintaining the sectarian divisions and exacerbated deliberately those sectarian divisions in Lebanon, plus sponsoring the Lebanese army, but ensuring that the Lebanese army has no air defense, and that while the US is pouring billions into weapons funding for Israel, it's providing very much less for the Lebanese army to keep it at a level where it can't defend itself against Israel. And so therefore you have this connection where the war against Russia and Ukraine is now coming into Syria. The Ukrainians are there training and increasing the technology available to the terrorist groups and taking the terrorist groups to fight in Ukraine against Russia. And then the connections between Israel and Ukraine. So the borders between the wars are dissolving. And I think, we've been in a world war scenario for some time. It's just that it hasn't been declared as such. But I think if you look at what's going on now, we are very certainly in a world war. And all of these nation states are vying for position and resources. People should remember that Israel takes 30% of its water supply from the occupied Golan territories that is Syrian territory. So it is all about the control of resources. And you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, of course, the blocking of the Belt and Road Initiative, the blocking of any global South independence, the blocking of any alliance between Russia, China and Iran, for example, BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation, all of these movements that threaten US-led supremacy in the world today are now being challenged. And I think if I have one message, I think people need to start making the connections. Many people are now saying, well, it's not our war. Syria is not our war. Well, it is, because all of the Western regimes are involved in this war and have been for actually 75 years, since 1946, the MI6 and CIA have been involved in clandestine operations, coup d'etat, military intervention, and black ops inside Syria to remove governments as part of an ongoing Cold War. So to prevent any kind of alliance that may give any global South country some kind of independence and access to its own resources and to free trade. So it is our war. I think that's the very important point to make here.
Thanks very much. So I really would like to thank both of you for joining me. I think this has been a really important conversation. I think everyone can hear that there is so much more, and both of you have a real wealth of knowledge on this. And I, again, would like to urge Americans to take action. Your congressman should know you on a first name basis. You should know every staffer in your congressman's office because you have called them so many times to tell them that we have to stop funding this. There's a lot more that needs to be done. And so in wrapping up, I'll just like to make a short note from our sponsor here. The Executive Intelligence Review News Service. I would encourage people to subscribe to the daily alert. You can find it at eir.news. And the LaRouche Organization, because we are now going to be building activity and chapters across the United States to actually address these things. People living in the United States have more power than people on the ground suffering through these crises. And we have a responsibility to address that. So thank you both so much. And we will wrap up, and I hope we have the opportunity to talk again under better circumstances.
Thank you.
Thank you.